What if the sky above us is less familiar than we imagine? On clear nights, Earth can feel self-contained, almost intimate. We look upward and think of stars, weather, moonlight, the occasional passing aircraft. Yet just beyond that visible calm, an invisible belt of motion surrounds the planet. Satellites speak to one another. Fragments of metal drift in silence. Old machines, broken tools, classified instruments, and forgotten relics move through darkness at astonishing speed. We often speak of orbit as if it were orderly, mapped, and fully understood. But the truth is quieter and more unsettling. Not everything above us has a simple story. Since the dawn of the space age, humanity has sent thousands of objects into the sky with confidence, ambition, and sometimes secrecy. Some carried cameras, some carried signals, some carried dreams about science, survival, and national pride. Over time, those launches created a kind of mechanical afterlife around Earth. We know much of it by catalog number and mission name. We track it with radar, telescopes, and algorithms. We tell ourselves the heavens have become an inventory, and yet every so often something appears that does not fit. An object turns up where it should not be. A signal arrives with no clear source. A satellite believed dead seems to move again. A piece of hardware returns from the dark, but matches no official record cleanly enough to settle the question. In those moments, orbit stops feeling like a triumph of pure knowledge and starts to resemble memory itself, incomplete, layered, and vulnerable to omission. This is not a story about fantasy hiding in the stars. It is a story about uncertainty, about how even in an age of sensors and surveillance, there are still gaps in the record, about the strange fate of things we launch and then lose, misidentify, conceal, or rediscover decades later. Above us, circling patiently through cold sunlight, are objects that reflect more than radio waves or radar. They reflect our ambitions, our rivalries, our oversights, and our need to believe we are keeping better track of our creations than we truly are. And perhaps the deepest mystery is not what those objects are, but what they reveal about us when we can no longer name them with confidence. It began, as many mysteries do, with a contradiction. For decades, orbit had been described as a realm of precision. Ground stations listened, military networks watched, civilian astronomers compared notes across continents. Each object was expected to have a launch, a purpose, a path, and eventually a decay. The mathematics seemed reassuring. If something was up there, someone, somewhere, should know what it was. But certainty in space has always depended on one fragile thing: the completeness of human records. In the early years of the space race, that completeness barely existed. Rockets rose in secrecy. Payloads were mislabeled, renamed, or hidden behind bland technical language. Failures were buried in bureaucratic silence. Successes were polished into national myth. What remained, once the headlines faded, was a growing archive of partial truths. A booster body here, a dormant satellite there, a cloud of fragments from a mission no one publicly wanted to discuss. Orbit became not just an engineering achievement, but a historical attic, cluttered with machines that outlived their explanations. Imagine standing in an old observatory at dusk, listening to the slow creak of metal under a turning dome. A telescope lifts toward a moving point of light. On paper, that object should be easy to identify. But the record is blurred. One database says inactive weather hardware. Another suggests a fragment from a defense test. A third offers no answer at all. In that moment, The object becomes more than an entry on a screen. It becomes a reminder that technology does not erase mystery. Sometimes it preserves it. This is where our journey truly starts. Not with the most dramatic object, but with the realization that the skies above Earth are layered with human intentions, and human intentions are rarely transparent. Some objects were secret by design. Others became strange only because time stripped away their context. A machine built for one clear purpose in 1968 can look almost mythic when encountered decades later, stripped of paperwork, drifting under a different generation's gaze. So before we ask which objects orbiting Earth seem not to belong, we have to ask a quieter question. What does belonging mean in a place shaped by rivalry, ambition, and forgetting? Perhaps the mystery was never that unknown things appeared above us. Perhaps the mystery is how confidently we assumed we would always recognize our own reflection when it passed overhead. What if the first truly unsettling object was not built to be mysterious at all? High above Earth, there are satellites that have outlived the worlds that launched them. Some were born in the fevered decades of the Cold War, when every orbit carried the weight of strategy, fear, and prestige. They were assembled by engineers who understood they were building not just machines, but messages. To place something in orbit was to declare reach. To keep it there was to prove endurance. Yet time has a way of stripping even the boldest declarations down to silence. Picture one of those early satellites now. Its surfaces are scarred by radiation and micrometeorites. Its batteries died long ago. Its mission ended before many people alive today were born. And still, it circles Earth, faithful to physics, indifferent to history. Below it, cities have changed names. Governments have risen and disappeared. Borders have shifted. The object remains, a survivor from an age that imagined the future in terms of rivalry and control. It is ours, technically, but it also feels like a relic from a civilization adjacent to our own. This is one of the quiet tensions of orbit. A machine can remain physically present while becoming culturally unclaimed. The paperwork grows obscure. The engineers retire or die. The mission is remembered only by specialists, if at all. To modern observers, especially when databases conflict or records are incomplete, such an object can seem almost alien in the plainest sense of the word. Not extraterrestrial, but estranged from the world, now looking at it. And that estrangement matters. It reminds us that technology does not belong only to the moment of its invention. It continues beyond intention. A satellite launched as an instrument of surveillance or communication may endure as a historical fragment, still moving, still visible, long after its meaning has broken apart. In orbit, obsolescence does not look like disappearance. It looks like persistence without explanation. So the mystery deepens, not because something impossible has been found above Earth, but because some of the oldest things still circling us no longer fit neatly into the story we tell about progress. They are artifacts of memory without a stable narrator, and when they catch the sun just right, becoming a brief point of silver in the dark, they ask a difficult question. How much of the modern world is still shaped by machines we no longer fully remember creating? It started with a signal that should have been gone. In the age of modern tracking, silence is often treated as a kind of death. A satellite stops transmitting, and gradually it slips from attention. Its orbit may still be known, its shape perhaps still visible to telescopes, but without a voice, it becomes background. Engineers move on. Databases mark it inactive. The object remains above Earth, but in human terms, it has faded. Then, on rare occasions, something extraordinary happens. A machine believed finished begins to speak again. These episodes are usually explained by physics rather than miracle. Sunlight strikes aging circuits at the right angle. A frozen battery stirs. Tumbling motion wakes a transmitter for a brief interval. Yet even when the explanation is mundane, the feeling is not. Imagine a spacecraft launched decades ago suddenly sending a pulse into the present, like a clock found buried in a wall, still keeping imperfect time. The signal may be faint, fragmented, or undeciphered, but it transforms the object instantly. It is no longer debris in the public imagination. It becomes presence. That is part of what makes orbit so emotionally strange. On Earth, abandoned things decay into stillness. In space, abandonment can remain active. An old satellite may continue moving with elegant precision, and under rare conditions, even resume some ghost of its original function. The result is unsettling, not because it suggests anything supernatural, but because it blurs the line between past and present. A mission that ended before the internet age can suddenly intrude on a world of smartphones and streaming data, as if history itself had found a way to transmit. These moments also expose how thin our confidence can be. We assume we know which objects above us are alive, which are silent, and which are lost forever. But the boundary is not always clean. Machines do not always fail in final, orderly ways. Sometimes they linger in thresholds, half-remembered, half-functioning, waiting for the right conditions to reveal that our categories were too neat. And so the sky acquires another layer of mystery. Not only are there objects whose origins are hard to trace, there are also objects whose endings refuse to stay ended. In that sense, orbit resembles memory again, dormant for years, then suddenly illuminated by a signal, reminding us that what we call forgotten is sometimes only waiting for the right light to return. What if the strangest objects in orbit were never meant to stay there long enough to become mysteries? Some of the most puzzling bodies above Earth are not elegant satellites at all, but leftovers. Upper rocket stages, detached panels, lens covers, fragments released during repairs, tests, collisions, or hurried maneuvers. They were created as byproducts of intention, the loose change of the space age. No one designed them to become symbols. And yet, once separated from the missions that produced them, they began lives of their own, circling the planet as anonymous witnesses to human activity. There is something haunting about that transformation. On the launch pad, every component has meaning. It belongs to a plan, a checklist, a countdown. But in orbit, meaning can break apart faster than metal. A discarded fuel tank becomes an unidentified target. A lost tool bag glinting in sunlight becomes an object of public fascination. A fragment from an explosion acquires its own path, its own risk, its own entry in a tracking catalogue. What was once insignificant becomes consequential simply because it did not fall away when expected. Imagine a small object tumbling over Earth at thousands of miles per hour, catching and releasing light like a distant wink. To an observer below, it might appear deliberate, almost theatrical, but its existence may be the result of a loosened fitting, a ruptured tank, or a forgotten failure from decades ago. That gap between appearance and origin is central to the emotional life of orbit. Space grants even accidental things a strange dignity. It turns debris into artifacts, and these artifacts tell a story that polished histories often avoid. Progress is not clean. Exploration does not move forward without residue. Every age leaves traces, and the space age leaves them in motion. The objects we lose above Earth do not vanish into metaphor. They remain physically present, forcing us to confront the material consequences of ambition. They are reminders that every breakthrough carries fragments with it, some literal, some cultural, some ethical. So when an unidentified object is detected overhead, the explanation may not be exotic. It may be something more revealing, a remnant of ordinary human error, persistence, or haste. Yet that does not make it less meaningful. Perhaps the true mystery is why we find it easier to imagine strangers in the sky than to recognize how often our own forgotten leftovers return to meet our gaze. There are times when the mystery is not the object itself, but the name attached to it. Orbit is full of labels, catalog numbers, mission titles, national designations, quiet abbreviations understood by engineers and analysts, but opaque to everyone else. These names create a sense of order, as though every moving point above Earth has already been captured by language. But labels can mislead as easily as they clarify. A classified payload may be hidden behind a harmless description. A military experiment may enter the public record under sterile technical phrasing. A fragment may inherit the identity of the rocket that carried it, even though its true story begins later, in separation, accident, or failure. This is where confusion becomes history. Imagine an object first tracked as one thing, then reclassified years later after new observations emerge. It has not changed physically. It is still the same metal in the same cold darkness. But human understanding of it shifts, and with that shift, the meaning of the object changes as well. Suddenly, it is not just equipment. It is evidence of how knowledge gets revised, corrected, and sometimes quietly rewritten. That process is especially revealing in space, where so much depends on partial visibility. Telescopes see brightness, shape, motion. Radar sees reflection and speed. Analysts compare orbits, signatures, old launch records, whispered assumptions. Much of the time, the system works, but sometimes identification becomes a kind of interpretation. One generation calls an object inert debris. Another sees signs of a dormant payload. One archive says routine mission hardware. Another hints at intelligence work or experimental design. The sky remains the same, while the stories beneath it compete for authority. And perhaps that is why certain orbital objects feel so unsettling. They remind us that the world is not made legible once and for all. Even in a domain built on calculation, meaning is still negotiated. Records are created by institutions, and institutions carry secrecy, pride, blind spots, and revision. What we call an object is often also a confession about what we are prepared to admit we know. So the question deepens again. When something above Earth seems not to belong, is the strangeness in the metal or in the unstable language wrapped around it? In the end, names can guide us toward truth, but they can also become veils, thin and official, drifting over the more complicated reality beneath. What if some objects remain mysterious, not because they are hidden, but because too many people are watching them for different reasons? Space has never been a purely scientific frontier. From the beginning, orbit was also a theater of strategy. Satellites could photograph military sites, intercept signals, test sensors, measure missile launches, or simply demonstrate reach. In that world, visibility became paradoxical. The object itself might be seen by many, even tracked publicly, while its true purpose remained protected behind layers of classification, euphemism, and national silence. It was present in the sky, yet absent from ordinary understanding. Picture a small body moving in a stable path, observed night after night by amateur astronomers with backyard telescopes, by government networks with far more powerful instruments, and by analysts comparing tiny irregularities in its motion. Everyone sees the same point of light, but they do not see the same object. For one observer, it is a technical curiosity. For another, it is a strategic asset. For someone else, it is a question mark whose answer may never be published. Orbit becomes a place where knowledge is not evenly shared, only unevenly glimpsed. This is one reason certain satellites acquire an almost mythic aura, not because they arrive from beyond human history, but because they sit at the border between public evidence and private explanation. Their trajectories are real. Their brightness can be measured. Their existence is undeniable. Yet the story attached to them is fractured, distributed among institutions that do not speak plainly, records that are incomplete, and observers who must infer purpose from behavior alone. Mystery, in this sense, is not the absence of data. It is the unequal ownership of meaning, and that has a deeply human dimension. We tend to imagine that seeing leads naturally to knowing, but orbit teaches a harsher lesson. An object can be visible for decades and still remain partly unresolved because visibility is not the same as transparency. Light tells us where something is. It does not tell us who intended it, what silence protects it, or what history has been edited around it. So as we follow these strange companions circling Earth, we begin to understand that secrecy is not always darkness. Sometimes it shines in plain sight, crossing the night with clockwork precision, asking whether a thing can ever truly be called known, when its meaning is divided between what the sky reveals and what human power refuses to say. It began with a shape that did not quite behave like a shape. Astronomers and satellite trackers are used to certainty expressed through motion. An object moves, reflects light, dims, brightens, tumbles, stabilizes. From those patterns, they infer size, spin, orientation, even possible purpose. But some orbital objects resist that logic. Their light curves fluctuate oddly. Their paths suggest past maneuvers no one expected. Their apparent forms seem to change depending on angle, season, or instrument. They are not impossible. They are simply difficult. And difficulty has a way of inviting imagination into the room. Picture a distant object crossing the edge of night, brightening suddenly, and then vanishing into near invisibility. To a casual observer, it might feel alive, almost intentional. In reality, the effect could come from rotating panels, polished metal, drifting attitude control, or an aging surface catching sunlight in brief, sharp flashes. Yet the uncertainty matters. In those small ambiguities, machines begin to resemble riddles. Their behavior is physical, but our interpretation of that behavior remains provisional. This is especially true for objects that were never meant to be publicly understood in detail. Experimental payloads, classified satellites, unusual mission hardware, or old debris caught in complex attitudes can all produce observational signatures that seem almost theatrical. A glint can look like communication. A shift in orbit can look like purpose. A silent object can appear watchful simply because it is difficult to model from the ground. The sky offers evidence, but evidence is not the same thing as closure. And so the human mind does what it has always done. It fills gaps with story. Not always recklessly, not always irrationally, but instinctively. We are meaning-making creatures. When something moves above us and resists immediate explanation, we lean toward narrative. We search for intention. We ask whether this object is active, forgotten, hidden, or misnamed. In that search, orbit becomes more than a technical environment. It becomes a mirror for how we confront uncertainty itself. Perhaps that is why these difficult objects linger in memory. They remind us that mystery does not require the supernatural. It only requires incomplete understanding, meeting persistent curiosity. And in that meeting, somewhere between mathematics and metaphor, the heavens become human again. Not because they are simple, but because they continue to humble the stories we tell about our ability to know them completely. What if the most revealing objects in orbit are the ones that come back wrong? Now and then, something leaves the sky. A capsule re-enters. A fragment survives descent. A long-lost component is recovered in a field, a desert, or the sea. In theory, return should bring clarity. Once an object is back in human hands, it can be measured, identified, and placed neatly into history. But return does not always resolve mystery. Sometimes it deepens it. Marks do not match expectations. Materials seem altered by time in ways records never anticipated. The object is recognized, yet not fully understood. There is a quiet drama in that moment. Imagine a team standing around a scorched piece of hardware. Its surface is blackened, its edges warped, its original purpose reduced to hints. Serial numbers may be missing. Documentation may be incomplete. The mission it belonged to may have been secret, forgotten, or politically inconvenient to remember in detail. Suddenly, the recovered object becomes more than evidence of engineering. It becomes a fragment of institutional memory. And institutional memory is often less stable than metal. Objects that return from orbit carry two histories at once. One is technical: launch, mission, exposure, decay, descent. The other is human: what was recorded, what was withheld, what was misremembered, and what no longer fits comfortably into the story. Recovery teams can identify alloys and bolts, but they cannot always recover context with the same precision. A machine may come home physically while remaining historically displaced, like a letter delivered decades late to an address that no longer exists. That is part of what makes orbital relics so compelling. They expose the limits of our confidence in documentation. We imagine archives as permanent, but archives are built by people, and people prioritize, conceal, forget, and simplify. By the time an object returns, the world that launched it may be gone. The language around it may have changed. The institutions that once gave it meaning may have dissolved into new names and new motives. So re-entry is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a second beginning, the start of a new interpretation shaped as much by absence as by evidence. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. We do not merely send objects into orbit. We send pieces of our own era, trusting that the future will know what to do with them. But when they fall back through fire and silence, they ask whether history itself survives the journey any better than metal does. There is another kind of mystery in orbit, quieter than secrecy and more ordinary than legend: the mystery of accumulation. No single launch created the strange ring of objects above Earth as we know it now. It formed gradually, piece by piece, decade by decade, through ambition repeated so often it began to feel normal. A satellite here, a test there, a failed mission, an abandoned stage, a burst tank, a collision, a cloud of fragments almost too small to see. Each event seemed finite at the time. Together, they became an environment. Orbit was no longer simply where we placed instruments. It became a place altered by our habits. Imagine standing beside the ocean and realizing that what looks like open water is also full of drifting traces from centuries of passage. Space is beginning to feel like that. Not empty, not pristine, but layered with evidence of use. And unlike on Earth, where weather and gravity help erase the past, orbit can preserve it with astonishing patience. An object launched in one political era may keep circling into another, crossing above nations that did not exist when it first left the ground. This accumulation changes the meaning of every unidentified object. A strange body in the sky is no longer a singular puzzle. It belongs to a crowded archive. It may be a relic of strategy, a remnant of carelessness, a survivor of engineering, or simply one more forgotten artifact among thousands. Mystery in orbit is not always about one object standing apart. Sometimes it is about too many objects existing together, each carrying a partial story until the sky itself begins to resemble a library with missing pages. And that raises a difficult question about responsibility. If orbit is now a human-shaped environment, then uncertainty above Earth is not just technical, it is ethical. What do we owe the future when our inventions remain long after their use is over? What does stewardship mean in a place where neglect can circle the planet for generations? These are not abstract questions anymore. They move over our heads every night. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the unknown object is not an exception to the space age. It may be one of its most honest symbols, because what we have built above Earth is not only a system of knowledge, but a landscape of leftovers, ambitions, and unresolved consequences. And like all landscapes shaped by human desire, it tells the truth most clearly when we stop pretending it is under perfect control. What if the real story of these objects is not that they are foreign to us, but that they have become too familiar to notice clearly? There is a danger in constant proximity. The more regularly something surrounds us, the easier it becomes to fade into background. We no longer feel the strangeness of thousands of human-made bodies crossing above the atmosphere. We treat them as infrastructure, as scenery for the modern world. Navigation works, messages arrive, forecasts improve, images of storms, crops, fires, and coastlines appear on our screens with quiet authority. Orbit has become useful, and usefulness can dull wonder. But every so often, an anomalous object interrupts that numbness. A forgotten satellite is rediscovered. A classified payload is tracked by civilians. A fragment flashes unexpectedly in the dark. In those moments, the familiar infrastructure of orbit reveals its other face, not seamless service, but layered history. We remember that above the systems we rely on is an older, stranger archive, filled with missions that were abandoned, concealed, improvised, or simply outlived by time. The sky stops being background and becomes evidence. That shift matters because it changes how we see ourselves. Human beings often imagine history as something stored in books, museums, ruins, and monuments. Yet some of our most revealing artifacts are not standing still on Earth. They are moving in silence overhead. They are pieces of a civilization that chose height over permanence, speed over ceremony, function over memory. We did not build them to endure as symbols. We built them to do a job. Their symbolism emerged only later, when they remained after the job was gone. And perhaps that is why these objects feel so poignant. They carry the emotional shape of modern life itself. Brilliant, technical, purposeful, and often forgetful of what it leaves behind. A dead satellite is not only a machine, it is a trace of confidence. A drifting fragment is not only debris, It is a record of momentum without conclusion. Together, they form a portrait of a species that reaches outward quickly, then spends decades learning how to live with the consequences of its reach. So the mystery resolves into something both simpler and deeper. The objects circling Earth may not be strangers at all. They may be among our most intimate creations, rendered strange only by time, distance, and neglect. And if that is true, then the question is no longer what these objects are. The question is what kind of memory we become when our own inventions continue speaking long after we have stopped listening. It started with a simple belief that the more we measured the sky, the less mystery it would contain. In many ways, that belief was justified. Modern tracking networks can follow astonishingly small objects. Civilian observers coordinate across borders. Archived launch records, declassified documents, and decades of orbital data have turned once hidden patterns into shared knowledge. The heavens above Earth are no longer a blank expanse. They are mapped, monitored, and interpreted with a precision previous generations could scarcely imagine. And still, precision has not abolished uncertainty. It has only made uncertainty more refined. That is the paradox at the heart of orbit. The better we become at seeing, the more clearly we notice what remains unresolved. An unexplained maneuver, a confusing catalogue entry, a relic whose origin is documented but whose meaning has drifted, a silent object that persists long after its era has vanished. Knowledge grows, and with it grows a subtler form of humility. We no longer fear the sky because it is empty of explanation. We respect it because explanation is never as complete as we hoped. Imagine two people watching the same point of light cross the night. One sees only motion. The other sees layers, launch history, orbital decay, political context, engineering choices, possible secrecy, probable debris lineage, catalogue uncertainty. Both are looking at the same object, yet one is seeing a star-like flash, while the other is seeing an unresolved chapter in the story of human ambition. That difference is not merely technical, it is philosophical. It reminds us that mystery is often not the absence of knowledge, but the presence of more meanings than one clear answer can hold. And so these objects above Earth begin to feel less like anomalies and more like teachers. They show us that modernity does not erase ambiguity. It reorganizes it. Even in a domain ruled by mathematics, we remain creatures of interpretation, assembling truth from signals, fragments, records, and missing context. The unknown object is not only a puzzle to solve, it is a mirror held up to the limits of certainty itself. Perhaps that is why orbit still moves us, not because it hides impossible things, but because it preserves a deeply human tension between discovery and doubt. And as our instruments sharpen and our catalogues expand, the old question returns in a quieter form. When we finally learn to track almost everything, will we also learn how to live with the things we still cannot fully explain? What if, in the end, the objects that seem not to belong are the ones that most honestly reveal where we are headed? Orbit is often described as the threshold of the future. It is where communication accelerates, where observation sharpens, where exploration rehearses itself before moving farther outward. But it is also where the future inherits the unfinished business of the past. Every unidentified fragment, every dormant satellite, every disputed catalogue entry reminds us that progress does not arrive on a clean page. It layers itself over old intentions, old rivalries, old mistakes. The next century in space will not begin from emptiness. It will begin inside an archive already in motion. Imagine a child looking through a telescope decades from now, tracking a point of light that was launched before they were born. By then, the object may be one of thousands from many nations and private companies, woven into a sky far busier than our own. To that child, the object may seem ordinary, yet hidden within it will be choices made by strangers long ago. What to build, what to name, what to reveal, what to leave behind. Orbit will still be carrying our decisions long after the arguments around them have faded. That continuity gives these objects a different kind of gravity. They are not only leftovers from earlier eras, they are precedents. They teach future generations what kind of species we were when we first surrounded our planet with machines. Did we act like careful stewards, mindful that even the near heavens could become crowded with consequence? Or did we behave as humans often do, at the edge of new possibility, brilliant, inventive, and slow to notice the trail of unresolved things accumulating behind us? This is why the mystery of orbit matters beyond curiosity. It is not simply about identifying stray hardware or reconstructing classified histories. It is about learning how memory functions in a technological civilization. What do we preserve? What do we obscure? What remains physically present after meaning begins to dissolve? These questions do not belong only to historians or engineers. They belong to all of us, because the world above Earth is no longer separate from daily life. It is part of the architecture of modern existence. And perhaps that is the quiet warning carried by these wandering objects. They suggest that the future will judge us not only by the breakthroughs we celebrated, but by the traces we failed to account for. In the cold clarity of orbit, nothing disappears simply because we stop speaking about it. It continues, circling patiently, waiting for someone in another age to ask what we thought we were doing when we sent it there. So where does this leave us? Beneath a sky crowded with artifacts we launched, mislabeled, forgot, rediscovered, and still do not fully understand. Perhaps it leaves us in a more honest relationship with knowledge. For much of the modern age, we have equated progress with clarity. We assumed that better instruments, better records, and better systems would steadily dissolve uncertainty, and often they have. But the objects orbiting Earth tell a more textured story. They show that knowledge is not a straight line from ignorance to mastery. It is a living process shaped by memory, secrecy, error, revision, and time. Even now, with all our tracking networks and databases, the heavens still contain questions carrying our own fingerprints. That may be the most human part of this story. These are not mysteries imposed on us by an indifferent universe alone. Many of them are mysteries we made. We built machines for war and weather, communication and research, prestige and precaution. We sent them upward with intent, then allowed time to complicate that intent until some became relics, some became risks, and some became symbols of how partial every record can be. Orbit, in the end, is not only a realm of technology, it is a portrait of civilization seen from the outside. And yet there is something hopeful in that realization. To recognize uncertainty is not to fail. It is to mature. It is to understand that stewardship matters as much as invention, that remembrance matters as much as launch, and that the future depends not only on what we create, but on how faithfully we account for what remains. The unknown object overhead does not only ask us to identify it, it asks us to become the kind of society that keeps better faith with its own creations. Look up on a clear night, and the sky may still seem calm. But beyond that calm, metal and memory are moving together. Old ambitions pass above new generations. Silent objects carry unfinished meanings through sunlight and shadow. And somewhere in that vast, circling archive is a timeless question, one that reaches beyond space itself. When our inventions outlast our explanations, what remains of truth, catalogued fact, fading story, or the humble willingness to keep searching anyway?